If this goes on, don't panic. Bringing hope to the world through speculative fiction.
Hello and welcome to episode 1. In this episode, we will be discussing HopePunk with Alexandra Rowland. We'll be focusing on her article, One Atom of Justice, One Molecule of Mercy, and the Empire of Unsheathed Knives, published on the Festive Ninja website. Thanks for joining us in this interview. I'm very excited to get this project off the ground, finally. It's something I and my co-host have been working on for a really long time. Upon conceiving of this podcast, we knew we had to bring Alexandra on. As you'll hear, she's been instrumental in pushing the HopePunk conversation forward in the science fiction and fantasy field. Before we start, I want to mention that things will change a bit every episode until we get settled. But my goal is to ensure that every episode has value to our listeners. After my last podcast, Alan Jeremy vs. Science Fiction, went under, I wasn't sure if I'd be doing anything else. But I'm glad to be able to present this interview to you as the first of what I hope to be many episodes on this new podcast. All right, so this is Alan, and we are here, Kat and I, first episode ever of If This Goes On, Don't Panic. And our guest today is Alexandra Rowland. She grew up on a sailboat in the Bahamas and then in a house in Florida. Sick of death of the tropics, they attended Truman State University in northern Missouri, where they studied world literature, mythology, and folklore. They now live in Western Massachusetts, where they work as an occasional bespoke seamstress and a writer under the stern supervision of their feline quality control manager. We also have one of those. And they can be found at Twitter as @AlexRowland. And she's always got something smart to say on there. I have been reading her Twitter a lot lately.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And actually, it's @_AlexRowland. The underscore is very important.
Oh, sorry. Yes, fail. I'm so sorry. So you are our first guest ever of all time. Thank you so much for volunteering to do that.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
You are very brave.
Well, I really love podcasting, and, not everybody will just let me wander off the street to be on their podcast. So,
well, Kat suggested you right away. Kat and I started talking about this podcast and what we wanted to do, and she's like, I think Alexandra should be our first guest. I don't know, Kat, you should talk about that.
Well, so this is sort of the genesis of the podcast, was that Alan bounced some ideas for podcasts off of me. And I said, wow, I really like this particular one. And actually, if you did that one, I would like to co-host it with you, which he very kindly did not say, well, that's a presumptuous of you, Rambo, or anything like that. But the reason that I was interested in it was he said, let's do a HopePunk centered podcast. And I was like, boy, that is so timely. I just finished last year. I did the anthology, the political anthology called If This Goes On. And I'm very interested in the idea of writing and politics and how writing can give us hope. And Alexandra is the person who came up, in fact, with the term HopePunk. I had read her books, which I just absolutely love. And so I wanted to talk about those books, and the idea of HopePunk seemed like a great place to start.
Cool. Fantastic.
So I guess for our audience, Alex, if you could just give us the general background for what that means, what that is, just so they know.
Sure. So HopePunk is a term that I came up with in the summer of 2017. I don't know if either of you recall the summer of 2017, but it sucked. Pretty much just sucked a lot. And yes. I looked around and I saw a lot of my friends and people I knew and people on the internet just sort of collectively looking at the world and seeing it with fresh eyes for the first time and going like, there are so many more problems than we ever realized. And suddenly they're right in front of us and we can't not see them anymore. And now there are even more problems that are directly impacting our lives. And what do we do about this? We, like so many people I know, just have not had to confront the fact of having to deal with a corrupt political system that is so obviously and overtly corrupt. And it seemed like a very grimdark sort of time. It seemed like all hope was lost. And
Yeah.
I made just this very sort of offhand shit post, really, on Tumblr, that the opposite of grimdark is HopePunk, because I was looking for a story that would sort of strengthen and bolster me in this time. I was hungry for something that would make me feel strong, and I didn't have a word for it. All I knew was I'm looking for whatever grimdark is not. I'm looking for the opposite of grimdark. What do we call that? HopePunk. Great. And then people started reblogging it and saying things in the comments like, I think I sort of implicitly, sort of instinctively understand what this means, but I want to make sure that I am understanding this correctly. Original poster, can you like explain it more? And so I thought about it for a second time and realized, oh shit, this isn't just something that I'm joking about. This is something that I'm actually really serious about and that I think is super important. So I wrote an essay that kind of went viral somehow, and people seemed to respond to it. It seemed to hit a part of their heart that was hungry in the same way that mine was. And then I think the first panel about it at a convention was at the Nebulas in 2017, I want to say. And now almost every convention that I go to, I am asked to be on a panel to talk about it. So it is,
Wow.
and NPR got me on to discuss it. So it's something that's definitely hitting the mainstream. It's something that is really affecting people and that people are responding to. And I think that even in and of itself is such a comforting and inspiring thing.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So wait, I just want to move back just a second. And that article was called "One Atom of Justice, One Molecule of Mercy."
So that came later.
Okay.
That like I wrote the essay and that was just the original Tumblr post. And then once it got popular, a year later, someone was like, "I want you to write an essay about HopePunk," and that took me, I think, like a whole summer to write. That took me like 4 to 6 months to write because that was a very, very difficult essay. And that went up last year. And that one went, again, sort of sub-viral. Then was the Vox.com article, and then NPR. And then we were kind of off to the races.
Wow, that's crazy.
It's been a lot. It's been weird. Also to be like known as the HopePunk person. And I keep telling, like, people keep wanting to interview me about it or wanting to talk to me about it. And I keep saying, well, it doesn't belong to me. This is something that belongs to everybody. And I am completely happy to keep talking about HopePunk for as long as HopePunk is a necessary and strengthening and empowering story to be telling. But also, I'm not the only voice of HopePunk. And I don't think that I should be the only voice of HopePunk.
To me, when I read HopePunk, I interviewed a lot of people at ReaderCon. You probably saw me running around at ReaderCon.
Yeah.
People the whole time. The punk kept coming up, the word punk. And with everything, cyberpunk, steampunk, whatever, whatever punk. Kat knows all the punks. She has a class about the punks.
I do.
Go ahead, Kat.
No, I was just going to say, to me, that's the most important thing. And I think that like steampunk has gotten sort of tamed, in that, steampunk has become in some ways just a sort of skin that you put on stuff, and it's got lots of gears and that. And we have to remember that punk is about the critique of power. It's about critique of the status quo. And it's about envisioning a better future, which is one of the reasons that I love about your books, is that your books are about community and the power of community. And I think that's huge.
Yeah, the way that I word it is that punk is the operative half of the word. Like, people tend to lean really hard on the hope half of the word. And when they're approaching Hope Punk kind of as a genre, the instinct, which I wrote about in my article, One Atom of Justice, One Molecule of Mercy, and the Empire of Unsheathed Knives, very long title, is that the instinct is to make Hope Punk soft and to lean on the nurturing and community aspects of Hope Punk, because that's what we're hungry for. But to get there, like, we have to remember the fighty, punchy, hard part of Hope Punk as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is, of course, the word that brought me in more. But I do feel to some degree that word is problematic in science fiction in particular, just because of what Kat is saying with the steampunk thing, where it becomes just this skin. Like cyberpunk used to be very gritty and that kind of feeling too, like fight back against corporations, right?
Yeah.
You know, and we had a lot of conversations about that at ReaderCon, actually. It just kept coming up. Even when I didn't bring it up, it kept coming up for some reason. But I do feel like this is one of those that is very deserving of that, because there is actually a political goal here. And there is actually that want to punch back, like you're saying. You know what I mean? Maybe it's just because we're here at the beginning. I don't know. So one thing that you mentioned in your article, so let me say, the article of yours that I read was One Atom of Justice, One Molecule of Mercy, and the Empire of Unsheathed Knives. And I did some other background research as well, but that is the main article I based most of my notes on. And it seemed like that's the one that a lot of people pointed to. And one thing that you said in there really stuck with me, and it was kind of about that community organization and the lives of average people. And it was interesting because I've just had seen an interview with George R.R. Martin saying that one thing that he wanted to do in Game of Thrones was to show the effect of all these wars and this devastation and all this on more common people than just the kings and the special chosen people, right? And he used Tolkien as his example of, okay, yeah, well, you've got the knights and you've got the hobbit, the special hobbits, right? And they go out and do this thing, but you only ever see the surface level. You never see what happens beyond that. And it just struck me that you kind of had that same feel for HopePunk, or that's something that you're also looking for in HopePunk. I mean, is that how you see it playing out?
Yes, for sure. I actually disagree that Tolkien didn't do this. I think that a lot of the descendants of Tolkien absolutely failed to get that part. But Tolkien himself was very much about kind of the everyman hero. Frodo isn't the chosen one. He wasn't destined to do it. He took up this quest with informed consent, or as much informed consent as he was able to have at that time. He knew what he was going into. He knew it was dangerous. And the reason that he's the hero is because he was the one who stood up and said, I will take the ring to Mordor. And then at the end of the series, we do see the effects on, not so much in the movies, but in the books for sure. The work isn't done when the ring is thrown into the volcano. Like, great, they've defeated the big bad evil, but what next? And they go home, and then there's the scouring of the Shire, where they still have to like save their personal local home and community and rebuild it and take it back from the damage and trauma and evil that had saturated the land even that far.
So I have seen you list Lord of the Rings as HopePunk. Is that accurate? Was that your list, or somebody just putting that list on you?
No, yeah, I would agree that Lord of the Rings is absolutely HopePunk, because, you know, in literary criticism, it's not always a good idea to look at the author's life when we're critiquing the work. But I think that in this case, it absolutely is necessary, because you look at the context in which Tolkien was writing. You know, he was coming out of the trenches of World War I, and he was watching people around him get dead, and the rise of chemical warfare, and seeing horrible killing going on at a scale that had never before been seen in the whole world. And he still came out of it and came up with a hero like Frodo, and saw that there was still good in the world when people who are just like you and me, people who enjoy the comfortable, soft things in life, you know, like having a pipe full of pipeweed and a big dinner and kicking your heels up on the couch afterwards, can still do good in the world by like taking up the work and deciding to make a difference.
Well, we do pipe oil now, pipeweed oil.
Oh, sure. Right. we vape it. Yeah, of course.
yeah. How do you feel this Well, first of all, what is your familiarity with solar punk? This is something else that I've been obsessed with, is solar punk. You fairly familiar with that at all?
Yeah, ish. I'm aware of it. I haven't read any literature of it specifically. Yeah, I don't think that I have any like deep critique that I can make of it. I know that a lot of people have compared it positively to HopePunk in many ways.
Yeah, well, that was going to be a question for me to you, is how much do you think this overlaps? Because I feel like there's a lot going on where I think solar punk is kind of more dedicated. And Kat, you could probably say something about this too. You have a story in a solar punk anthology specifically.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like solar punk is more like trying to find pragmatic, real solutions to real world problems via fiction, maybe a little more than Hope Punk is, whereas Hope Punk is more of like, let's have stories that don't grind our brains into the ground. You know what I mean? Like make us want to live life, or not live life.
I would say with solar punk and probably nanopunk and biopunk and all of that, it is maybe not biopunk, but like a celebration of the possibility of material sciences. The fact that solar power may be the thing that saves us. And in fact, this is really interesting to me because Ted Cruz recently came on and it was like, well, they're saying shut down all the coal and gas plants. So I guess we're going to power everything on pixie dust. Really? I mean, solar power is getting better all the time. There's actually huge potential there. There's hydroelectric power. There's wind power. I mean, there's renewable energy is there. And it just seems so typical of this administration to just be like, well, that stuff doesn't exist. And those punks are about the fact that it does exist. Whereas I think Hope Punk is more about an attitude than the material science.
Yeah, I would say the Venn diagram of Hope Punk and Solar Punk is Hope Punk is the big circle, and then Solar Punk and all of the other punks are like smaller ones within it. I think Hope Punk covers all of them, but Solar Punk specifically, as I perceive it personally, is primarily oriented towards how do we solve the problem of climate change and what can we do with renewable energy and the sciences, as Kat said. And that is a part of Hope Punk, but it is a broader sort of thing as I perceive it.
Interesting. Yeah, I like that explanation. And I was wondering how that went in your mind, being somebody who's much more involved in the development of the idea, right?
Yeah.
Because I had heard of solar punk first, and then I kind of came around to Hope Punk, and I had researched a lot of solar punk for episode of Alan and Jeremy versus science fiction that came out back in October. And it's pretty old, you know what I mean? Like,
it's been around. It's been around since the 90s, I want to say.
Yeah, and I was really surprised to learn that. I really had no idea. It was very, I guess you would call it underground or, just not talked about until fairly recently, I would say.
Yeah, I think it's definitely gotten more traction lately because I think that, climate change is becoming a bigger and bigger problem and something that we are more and more aware of. And whenever there is a problem that we are aware of, people look for stories that tell us how to fix it.
Yeah. So I want to segue there. So you started talking about stories about how to fix it. One thing that you mentioned in your article was you were talking about Noble Bright and how it's kind of easier to make a small few heroes cool and stylish, and that's kind of what I think people in our culture look for. You know what I mean? To have one or two heroes that are cool and stylish and can carry the story right. But Hope Punk is more about the community. What's the difference in writing a more community-based hero and more of like your traditional King Arthur hero,
Well, so from a writing craft perspective, one generally still has to have a protagonist. That's usually a helpful thing to have.
Sure.
But, it's the difference between... So with Noble Bright, just in case any of your listeners are not familiar with it, Noble Bright is sort of the Arthurian legends. It says that, like Grimdark, it says there is good and there is evil, but evil is something that we can defeat. All we have to do is kill the bad wizard, and then evil will be gone from the world semi-permanently, quote unquote permanently. And then we can all relax. The king is the king because he is good, because he has a mandate from God that he is the worthy and noble person who deserves to lead us. And that sort of trickles down to the chosen one trope that comes into a lot of fantasy. And we think that, so the chosen one is sort of the same thing as the king, right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of receiving a mandate from the quote unquote gods. You know, he is the hero because he is, and you notice that I say he because this is kind of how the trope goes. It's usually a young man. He has some kind of mandate from on high. He is the chosen one because of destiny, because he is the one who is worthy and deserving to lead us. And HopePunk is like, well, we're all kind of humans. We're all flawed and broken in certain ways. We all make mistakes. And there is no chosen one. There's no one person who can save us. You know, we all have to do the work. If we want to live in a nice, tidy house, then we all have to do the chores to keep the house nice. And if we want to live in a nice society, then we all have to contribute to that society because entropy is real. And if we don't do the work, then we will fall back into the hands of people who are less scrupulous than we are, or who are even more flawed and broken than we are.
Do you feel like, because you mentioned there has to be a protagonist, right?
Right. Because that's how stories work.
Right. No, I totally agree. I mean, I'm not going to, but do you find that like being forced to have maybe a single or two protagonists kind of unwittingly feeds into that this person has been chosen kind of trope?
I think that if you're not aware of it, it certainly can. Because for one thing, we all want to feel special. We all want to be the chosen one. We want to like have that, oh yes, you are in charge of this because magical reasons, right? So, but once you become aware of the fact that you as an individual have a community around you, it becomes kind of impossible to write about any other way of doing it, because you just like have this awareness in the back of your head of, oh, this person probably has a family, whether that is a biological family or a family of choice. No one exists in a vacuum. You know, we all have people that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. And even the most alone person among us still interacts with other humans, you know, and every interaction that we have with someone is an opportunity to approach it with a HopePunk kind of perspective and like be kind to them for no other reason than just because they are a human who is tediously existing side by side with us. And that includes the cashier at the grocery store, or the teller at the bank, or just someone that you encountered on the street. You know, you always have an opportunity to treat them with kindness because they are, even in a distant and tenuous kind of way, still part of your community.
And Kat, feel free to jump in.
I'm listening with great interest because, I mean, this stuff is just so timely that it just breaks my heart.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah, for sure.
But I do think, I read something recently where they were talking about stories are shifting away from that pattern of romance to the pattern of the family. And so we have fewer love stories and more stories of families, not necessarily of families by blood, but families by choice. And so it seems to me like with Becky Chambers' Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, that's an ensemble. It's a cast of multiple people. And in this book that I have coming out next year from Tor, it's intended to be an ensemble. It's told an omniscient point of view for that reason. And I think we are seeing, maybe that's a sort of weird, distorted reflection of the chosen one, right? The idea of soulmates and that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. But I think we are seeing more, again, the word community pops to mind.
It's interesting. It also reminds me of T.J. Barry's book, Space Unicorn Blues, which, by the way, if you haven't read it, it is bonkers as hell.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like that found family thing as well. So we are actually coming up to the end of a half hour already. I want to ask you one more question, Alex, and then get to anything else that Kat wants to say, and then we have to recommend some books. But my last question is, I was reading up a little bit on the criticisms of HopePunk. And the main one that I have heard is that people are trying to finagle anything to be HopePunk. Like, oh, there's this horror story where everybody is horribly mutilated and everyone dies in the end, but there's a little bit of hope because the guy who died at the end could have made it. What do you think about that? What are your feelings about that?
So when I was writing the first essay on Tumblr, I was 1000% aware that people would misinterpret it because it is an idea that has a lot and requires a lot of nuanced thought. I think that if people are arguing about what counts as HopePunk, that is a great, good sign. I would never want people to just sort of blindly accept my definition of it. I think that it's something that is dynamic and that can grow over time. And it has certainly grown far enough that it has completely gotten away from me. So I think that, people are going to have their own definitions for it. And if an individual says to me, this is HopePunk, then I think that that is totally valid. But I think that it is also possible to completely disagree with them, right? Like we might look at that horror movie and say, how can this possibly be HopePunk? Everybody dies. It is so grim and dark. Yeah. But, if a person finds inspiration and meaning in it, then I think that that is like a completely valid thing. So more power to them.
Okay.
Yeah. I have a very broad and liberal definition here. Just like go play, go have fun. I made the thing. Now you guys get to go like run around and test drive it and try to break it and see what happens.
Well, you also want to think about the fact that anytime you've got something that challenges the system is going to try and co-opt it in some way. And so if they can make money off of HopePunk, I mean, just look at all the money they make off of feminism. Like the feminism t-shirt that sells for $40 because it's made out of high-grade Egyptian cotton. I mean,
A couple months ago, I had a marketing agency reach out to me to be like, hey, we would like to pay you to get on the phone and talk to us about what HopePunk is. Of course, I was like, how much are you going to pay me? And they were like, $500. And I was like, oh, well then, it's very HopePunk to be able to pay your bills. So sure. But at the same time, like I was very, very aware of every word that I told them because in one interpretation of it, they're the enemy, right?
Yeah.
They're recognizing that it is a thing that is moving through our society. They're recognizing that people are reacting to it and responding to it. And of course they want to make money off of it because that's their job. So I was extremely aware of the things that I told them and the ways that I defined it to them. And I may have leaned extremely hard on the anti-capitalist aspects of HopePunk, but
It's a tough thing to struggle with because, I've been a musician since I was 15. I've been in punk bands from basically 15 till, people even define my current band as a punk band, even though we're not like a classic punk band. And I'm 40 now. And there is a struggle in the middle there when at the end of my 20s, I'm like, well, I'm not really a kid anymore and I got to pay my bills.
Yeah.
Am I selling out? What am I doing?
Yep.
Like, what is my life right now? Has everything I've stood for up to this point shit? You know what I mean?
Yep.
Or
like total fraud.
Well, it's a struggle. It's a real thing, and it's tough because it's like, I've always been pretty anti-capitalist and all this kind of stuff. And now here I work, and I won't say who I work for, but it's a very large corporation, right? And a younger part of me died, right, when I started working for these places.
Yeah.
But it's just not realistic for everybody to always fight that.
Absolutely. And I think that the concern about selling out is real. And that was also like something that I was a little bit flippant when I was like, oh, yes, of course I will take your money. But I did stop and ask myself, am I doing the right thing by agreeing to talk to this marketing agency about HopePunk? Because it was a concern. But my reasoning at the end was kind of, well, I have the opportunity to get in on the inside and influence the people who are making these decisions, or they will go ask someone else and be influenced by someone else. And so the good that I can do is to positively influence people wherever I can. And sometimes that is going to involve taking a stack of cash Cool.
Right,
Great.
right.
Good. I mean, as long as if I can also personally benefit while I am doing good in the world, that's not a bad thing, you know?
Yeah,
We
sure.
all have to survive, and we live in a capitalist hellscape. And so there is an aspect of having to work with the system because you don't get to just opt out entirely.
Yeah.
And it's ugly and it's bad, but you know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. It's true. You kind of just have to do the best you can for yourself and try to make what positive changes you can while also living.
Yep, exactly.
Right? I mean, I read an interview with the lead singer from Modest Mouse. This was like 10 years ago, right after they got big. And they're like, well, don't you feel like you're selling out? He's like, I've got kids, man.
Yeah.
I got to feed them.
Yep.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
Like, I'm a musician who's able to feed my kids. That's awesome. And I can control the music that I put out. You know, my mind often goes back to that interview.
I think I've read about that interview before. And yes, 1000%. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Kat, any final words or comments or thoughts? We're at 34 minutes.
I guess, like, if somebody's trying to write HopePunk, Alexandra, what would you give them as an initial sort of recommendation?
For books or for ways to write it?
For getting into the right mood, the right mindset.
So one of the ways of getting into the mindset of HopePunk that works really well for me is listening to music that gives me the right feeling. And there's a almost explicitly HopePunk album by Frank Turner called Be More Kind, which I would highly recommend to everyone. It's a wonderful album.
I love him, by the way. He's amazing.
He is great. He does wonderful, meaningful music that is also catchy to listen to. What else could you ask for?
I have a friend who tours with him a lot, Homeless Gospel Choir.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone out there, check him out. He would be HopePunk too, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Just like looking around and finding the things in your life or in your community that give you hope or that give you a little bit of faith in humanity in this dark time in the world when it is so easy to lose our faith in each other, I think would be the thing that I would offer them. And in terms of like media recs, I have more of those as well. But I think that it's important also to like look more broadly at it because not every person is going to respond to a book or TV show or movie in the same way. So it's important to also have the critical thinking skills to find the things in your life that are going to give you the strength to keep going.
Well, why don't we just segue right into your book recommendations then? I mean, that's just like a perfect...
Sure. So you said you emailed me for book recommendations, but this is actually half TV shows and movies.
Good.
Yeah, so we mentioned Tolkien already, and we had a great conversation about that. One of my favorite movies of all time is a Russian film called Stilyagi, which is about a hipster subculture in Moscow in the 50s, which was going directly against the Soviet Union and everything it stood for, and idealizing American music and American fashion, and also because of the huge prevalence of propaganda that they were facing, it was all having to be smuggled in and being distorted by sort of a very long, elaborate game of telephone. So it's about this young man who is very much a loyal member, a loyal Soviet citizen, and he encounters this hipster subculture and falls in love with a girl and has his mind completely open and starts listening to American music and following these distorted American fashions. At the end of the movie, I'm going to spoil it for you, but it's important. One of his friends in this the subculture is given the choice by his father that if he wants anything else, he's going to have to give up this subculture, get a haircut, put on proper Soviet men's clothes, be respectable, and marry this nice Russian girl, and we'll send you to America. So he does, and he comes back and says, there's no one like us in America. It's just the same as it is here. We think that we are mimicking this American subculture. It doesn't exist. The main character of the movie stops and says, but we exist. And at every point during this movie, you think that it's going to turn towards this sort of stereotypical dreary Russian movie and everything will be terrible and bad, but it keeps making the choice to take the route of kindness and to take the more positive route. It's so wonderful and colorful, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. I also recommend a lot of the Discworld books by Terry Pratchett, specifically the Sam Vimes books. Yeah. Sam Vimes, as far as I am concerned, is the face of HopePunk. He is a police officer who, at the beginning of his character arc, wakes up drunk in a gutter and is at the lowest possible point of his life and finds community and finds purpose. And he is never a perky or optimistic or cheerful person at all. He's like this gritty, hardened cop. But at the same time, like, he is standing up against the forces of darkness and putting his foot down and saying, like, no, that's against the law. You don't get to do that. I think that that is amazing. I would also recommend the Book of the Unnamed Midwife by Meg Elison, which is probably the most gritty and dark of my recommendations. It is borderline grimdark. So there's this plague that sweeps across the nation, sweeps across the world, and kills most of the women. Of the women that survive, almost all of them are either sterile or unable to bear living children. And the main character is a midwife. And there is something that is so inherently and fundamentally stubborn and hopeful about being a midwife in this world where maybe your life's purpose isn't something that's ever going to be possible anymore. But she keeps trying, and she keeps taking care of the women around her and doing the one small thing that she can to make their lives better whenever possible. And then I would also recommend the Netflix show Sense8, which is also very strongly about community and fighting back against oppressors. And it has some really good queer representation as well.
Yeah, I've seen the first season of that, and I enjoyed it. And then I stopped watching it for some reason, and then I kind of like never quite got back to it. Isn't there a movie in the middle? Wasn't it like season 1, then a movie, and then season 2 or something like that?
So they got canceled unexpectedly. And so the last episode was kind of a quote unquote movie because it was, I think, twice as long as all of the other episodes, just so that they could wrap up the plot and give it a good, satisfying ending rather than just like dropping it.
Right. I think when it got canceled, I stopped.
I would recommend finishing it. It's good stuff.
Yeah. All right. Kat, do you want to go next or shall I?
I will mention 2 things. The first is a series by Alex White. I just read the first 2 books and then actually hunted Alex down and said, is the third one available yet? Oh, did you need a beta reader? The first book's A Big Ship at the Edge of the Universe, and the second one is called A Bad Deal for the Whole Galaxy, and they are space opera and tons of fun. And a shout out for a TV series that I just found and binge watched recently because it's really super cute and fluffy, which is Superhero Girls, which is a cartoon and has tiny Green Lantern and tiny Batgirl. And it's just adorable because it's all about female friendship. And I think it is super sweet.
Oh, I've seen that one on there. I tried to get my boys to watch it. I'll get them to watch it eventually. They watch anything superhero.
It's super cute.
So I have 2 recommendations. They are not HopePunk at all. The first is the second season of The Witch Who Came In from Cold,
nice.
Which was Serialbox. Authors are Ian Tregalis, Cassandra Rose Clark, Fran Wild, Max Gladstone, and Lindsay Smith. And I reviewed the first season back in an Alan and Jeremy episode. I think it was episode 20. I kind of gave it like a middling review for me. I did enjoy it and everything. And I made some comments about it, which after finishing the book, I want to officially retract some of those comments because I thought there were some inconsistencies, but I had not finished the last chapter. Long story that I explained back in that episode. But I finished it and it came back together. And season 2 was awesome. I mean, it just pumped everything up to 11. The magic was cooler. There was like more explosions. There was new characters that were awesome. And there's just so many different factions, and they kind of clicked all the factions one more direction, and then all of a sudden now new people were fighting each other, and and then they had to resolve all these crazy relationships, and it was really cool. I do feel like it loses a bit from the first novel, and I won't say any spoilers, but there was a certain plot point in particular that they just never resolved. It kind of just like faded into the background and disappeared. And it kind of ended with expectation of a third season, I feel like. And then, as far as I know, there is not one. I actually asked Serialbox if they were going to have a third one, and a couple months ago when I asked them, they said no. But I'm really hoping that they do come out with a third season. And even though the ending was kind of a little weird, the journey is definitely worth it. It's really cool if you like urban fantasy, Cold War kind of spy stuff, and historical settings. All stuff that I particularly enjoy. And then the second book I wanted to talk about was The Promise of Space by James Patrick Kelly. And that was just published last year. Great short fiction collection. He covers everything from AI, sex bots, witches, ghost stories. Everything is masterfully written. If you've ever written or read one of his stories, you know that he's just a master of the art of short fiction. And he's a guy that you don't hear about very often, weirdly, because he's so great and he's always publishing stuff. But I guess because he's more in that short fiction range. So please go check him out. My favorite stories were The Promise of Space, which was sad and heartbreaking. It's about a wife who tries to resurrect her husband using an AI. And it's just, going through that experience of trying to mimic somebody. And is it real? Is it not real? Awesome. And then the last story was called The Last Judgment, and a very funny, very fascinating world that he created. In this story, there's a detective in a world without men, and she's expected to track down an art thief, but also in the process has to try and understand humanity's new alien rulers and how they fit into the whole thing. And it was just a really great story. So go out and check out that collection. And that's everything I got. Just want to say thanks to Alex for coming out and talking to us for about 40 minutes here, and we really appreciate it.
Well, thank you again so much for having me on.
It's been super.
Before I talk a little bit about the interview, I forgot to ask Alexandra about her current projects. After the interview finished, I did remember to ask her, and here's what she had to say.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I actually have a couple of things to promote. We are recording this episode in September. I know you mentioned that it wasn't going to be released until a couple months from now. So, dear listeners, if you are listening to this in December or whenever, I will have had a book come out a couple months ago. A Choir of Lies is the sequel to my debut novel, which came out last year, A Conspiracy of Truths. It is a duology, which is very much about the power of stories and the power of storytelling and how stories can change the world. A Choir of Lies in particular is extremely HopePunk. It is about community and recovery from grief and trauma and kindness and doing the one little thing that you can to reach out to the people around you and to help them. It's also a fantasy novel about tulip mania. So if you're into stuff like that, check it out.
All right. So before I wrap things up, there are a few things I really took away from this conversation that I wanted to mention. First, I love the emphasis on community. This is something I certainly feel is missing these days, and I think a lot of other people probably do as well. I was also surprised to hear that Alexandra thought Lord of the Rings was HopePunk. It certainly wasn't the first thing on my mind when I first heard of HopePunk, but I thought Alexandra really gave me a new way to think about that particular story. Thinking about it now, it seems obvious that Sam and Frodo are messengers of that positive feeling. Please let us know what you think about this episode, what you thought about the interview. Hit us up on Twitter, Facebook, or even on the comments on our website. Before I go, I want to say thanks to Alexandra for spending time discussing stories with us, and thanks to everybody out there for listening. And don't forget to share our podcast with your friends on Facebook or Twitter. Goodbye, and I will see you next time. This Goes On, Don't Panic is edited by Alan Bailey, with production by Rachel Renee. Our theme music is by Father Flamethrower and Sable Aradia. Additional music is by Christopher Snydrowski. The intro is by Dave Robison. Special thanks to our guest Alexandra Rowland. Thanks for supporting us, and we'll see you again soon.